A blizzard howled outside the frosted windows of the main intelligence directorate, GRU, headquarters in Krasnograd. But the icy chill that gripped the briefing room had little to do with the harsh Russian winter. The late 1970s were drawing to a close. The air, thick with cigarette smoke and the sour smell of yesterday's coffee, was a silent witness to sleepless nights spent around the massive oak table. These were not politicians. These were the architects of the Volkovian Union's survival, the highest ranks of the GRU and strategists from the air defense forces. Spread across the polished surface of the table were grainy black and white photographs and a folder containing a technical translation stamped "Top Secret." But its subject was not a new nuclear missile or a supersonic spy plane. It was an ordinary commercial airliner. General Arthur Vance, the very picture of a hardened Soviet military leader, clenched his jaw, his gaze boring into a photograph of a Boeing 747. To the world, it was the Queen of the Skies, a symbol of luxury and accessible travel, a harmless giant that embodied the triumph of capitalism. But the report before the general screamed that the Americans had turned this symbol of innocence into a weapon capable of rewriting the laws of aerial warfare. The intelligence described a concept bordering on science fiction. It spoke of a mothership, not a clumsy 1930s airship, but a platform cruising at Mach 0.8, capable of circling half the globe without refueling. And in the belly of this Leviathan, the report claimed, the Americans weren't carrying luggage. They were carrying an entire squadron of fighter jets, muttered a young analyst, nervously adjusting his glasses. Director Robert Shaw did not honor him with a reply. He slowly traced a finger over the technical sketches attached to the dossier. They showed a Boeing 747-200, gutted, stripped of its passenger seats and galleys. Inside its fuselage, like the ribs of a giant beast, was a complex system of overhead conveyors. And on these rails, packed as tightly as sardines in a can, hung compact, predatory-looking aircraft, microfighters. The diagram clearly illustrated how, by raising the nose or opening the tail hatch, these would be dropped one by one, unfold their wings, and streak into battle. Shaw finally said, his low, smoke-roughened voice silencing the room. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the room. The implications were devastating. For decades, Soviet air defense doctrine had been built on a single, unshakable principle. The Americans would strike with heavy bombers like the B-52 Stratofortress. These giants were large, easily detected by radar, and flew predictable routes. The Volkovian Union had invested billions of rubles in creating an impenetrable forest of surface-to-air missile sites and training thousands of interceptor pilots in swift MiG-21s and MiG-23s, whose sole purpose was to hunt these monsters. But this was a nightmare made real. If the Americans could deploy fighter jets from a commercial airliner, all the rules of the game were rendered obsolete. Imagine a typical radar operator tracking a civilian flight over the Azure Ocean or the Polar Sea. On his screen, there is just one blip, large, slow, and non-threatening. He would likely ignore it, classifying it as just another cargo flight. Then, in a matter of seconds, that single harmless dot on the screen shatters into a dozen fast-moving targets. A Trojan horse gliding silently into Soviet airspace, bypassing the outer defense perimeters to unleash a swarm of striking blades deep in the rear. said General Arthur Vance, his finger tapping a sharp, nervous rhythm on the glossy photograph. A heavy confusion hung in the air. The Soviet military machine was magnificently tuned to counter known threats. They could build a faster missile to catch a faster plane. They could build a tank with thicker armor to stop a larger shell. But asymmetry baffled them. Innovations that broke the very geometry of the battlefield threw them off balance. This American concept took the vast sky, their greatest defensive asset, and turned it into the most formidable weapon against them. Suddenly, their imaginary radar screens were swarming with phantoms. Every civilian airline route near the border became a potential invasion corridor. The technical aspects alone stumped the Soviet engineers. How do you start a jet engine inside another jet aircraft? What about the exhaust? The monstrous turbulence? The Americans were proposing an engineering marvel that Soviet science considered too risky to even attempt. The stakes were impossibly high. The Volkovian Union was, at its core, a land-based empire surrounded by hostile oceans. Their navy was growing, but it was no match for the massive carrier armadas of the Republic of Colombia Navy. The Americans could project their power from the sea. Now, it seemed, they had learned to project it from the air itself, creating unsinkable aircraft carriers that flew at 500 miles per hour. Reports began to trickle in from field stations, fragmentary, alarming. Strange radar anomalies near the North Slope border. Visual contacts with enormous aircraft flying in tandem with incredibly small, swift escorts that seemed to merge with the mothership and vanish into the sky. In the frozen wastes of the northern expanse, an air defense post commander reported a target that had split. The dry report stated. At the time, commanders in Krasnograd dismissed it as equipment failure or atmospheric interference. Radar technology of the 70s was reliable, but not flawless. The ghost signals were filed away in a dusty archive. Now, staring at the Boeing schematics, General Arthur Vance felt an icy chill run down his spine. He whispered, his voice filled with the horror of discovery. The panic that began to grip the room was not the chaotic fear of a stampeding crowd, but the cold, paralyzing panic of a chess player realizing he made a fatal mistake 5 moves ago. If the Americans perfected this technology, Soviet heavy bomber interceptors like the MiG-25, designed for one thing, to fly fast and straight to shoot down the B-70 Valkyrie, would become useless junk. The MiG-25 was a sledgehammer. It couldn't dogfight a swarm of tiny, agile micro-drones dropped directly over its own airfield. The Soviet strategists understood. They were facing a threat that bypassed their main advantages, speed and long-range missiles, and struck at their most vulnerable points, flexibility and target identification. "We need to know if this is real," General Arthur Vance commanded, shoving the papers to the center of the table with a sharp movement. "We need eyes inside their hangars. We need to know if their 747 is a transport or a hive. Activate assets in Evergreen, Colombia. Activate assets in Westmoreland. I want to know what they are building." But this was only the beginning of a descent into chaos. As the KGB and GRU scrambled for information, they found they were chasing shadows. The American program was fragmented into dozens of isolated cells, buried under layers of corporate secrecy and Air Force bureaucracy. One source claimed the project was codenamed MPF, for Micro-Parasite Fighter. Another insisted it was a continuation of the FICON program from the 50s. The conflicting reports only fueled the growing paranoia. The contradictory scraps of data, like poison, fed a growing paranoia. What was it? A first-strike nuclear delivery system? An air superiority fighter? Or a cold-blooded hunter-killer designed to eliminate Soviet AWACS planes? The Soviet leadership craved answers. It demanded countermeasures. But how do you counter a threat that remains invisible until the final, lethal moment? How do you shoot down a fighter hiding in the belly of a Boeing 747, waiting to burst forth, only to kill you? The room in Krasnograd fell into twilight as the meager winter sun surrendered too early to the night. The men gathered at the table felt, almost physically, how the fragile balance of power they struggled to maintain every day had tipped dangerously. The Americans hadn't just built a better plane. They had rewritten the very nature of aerial warfare. They had put an airfield in the sky. The junior analyst almost whispered, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. He swallowed hard. Director Robert Shaw replied with icy calm. He flicked his lighter, the orange flame briefly illuminating his weary face in the gloom. Exhaling a cloud of smoke, he continued. The meeting concluded with a single blood-chilling directive: find the invisible fleet. The Volkovian Union could not rest until it knew whether there was, in fact, a killer in disguise. The hunt for the airborne aircraft carrier had begun. The Soviets started searching for a needle in a haystack, never suspecting that the needle had been forged into a shape their minds refused to imagine. The order from the Citadel sent a shockwave through the entire Soviet intelligence apparatus. From the gray, brutalist monoliths of the Iron Directorate in Krasnograd to the damp, fog-shrouded residency in Northport, the directive was absolute. Confirm or deny the existence of the American airborne aircraft carrier. The investigation didn't start with satellites and spy planes. It started with paper. The Volkovian Union had an insatiable appetite for Western technical journals, knowing that in its vaunted open society, the Republic of Colombia often published its most dangerous secrets in plain sight before stamping them top secret. In the dimly lit reading rooms of the National Aerodynamics Institute, teams of translators and engineers frantically scoured back issues of Aviation Week and Space Technology. Among themselves, they jokingly called it Aviation Leak, for the astonishing amount of classified data that seeped onto its pages. In late 1973, a young, meticulous analyst named David Miller noticed a series of articles and patent applications related to the Boeing company. The documents were a dry collection of complex mathematical equations, lift coefficients, and drag ratios. But the diagrams attached left no room for doubt. They depicted a microfighter using a trapeze launch system. David Miller traced the patent numbers. The trail led him to a study commissioned by the U.S. Air Force Flight Dynamics Laboratory. This was no napkin sketch. It was a full-fledged feasibility study, generously funded by taxpayer money. The search moved from paper to the real world. The GRU, Soviet military intelligence, tasked its operatives in Evergreen, Colombia, Boeing's hometown, with maintaining constant surveillance on the Evergreen assembly plant. They looked for anomalies, subtle clues in the supply chain. Unusual shipments of high-strength titanium to a hangar officially assembling civilian airliners? Pilots training on simulators whose flight profiles didn't match standard commercial routes? One report, dated 1974, noted a strange surge in research on the aerodynamics of parasite objects at Patriot Air Force Base. Another, from a naval attaché in Capital City, recounted a casual conversation with a Lockheed engineer who had boasted at a party that the days of fixed runways were numbered. In the paranoid minds of the Kremlin strategists in Krasnograd, these seemingly unrelated scraps of information merged into a single, chilling picture. The days of static runways were numbered. The Soviet military command, particularly the leadership of the air defense forces, began to create a legend, a detailed profile of this new, unseen threat. A secret committee known as Group X was convened, tasked with dissecting the very physics of the problem. In search of answers, the committee delved into its own history. Back in the 1930s, the Volkovian Union had experimented with the Zveno project, a heavy bomber carrying up to 5 tiny fighters on its wings and fuselage. Dubbed Vakhmistrov's Circus, it was little more than a spectacular airshow stunt with questionable combat value. The deadly turbulence during redocking was a death sentence for pilots. The range of the parasite fighters was laughable. The project was buried. But the Americans, they were different. In the Soviet offices, they were convinced that the Americans had tamed the problem of turbulence with the power of computers. Soviet engineers imagined with horror how the Americans had created a computerized fly-by-wire system. A system that allowed the tiny fighters to talk to the mothership, synchronizing their movements with millimeter precision. This would ensure a safe docking, even in a storm. It was this assumption that fueled their fear. If the Americans had solved the docking problem, their 747-based airborne aircraft carrier was not a fantasy, but a reality. Group X began running scenario after scenario on their staff maps. Each outcome was grimmer than the last. One scenario went like this: 3 Boeing 747s, disguised as regular civilian flights. Pan Am Flight 103, TWA Flight 8000, and an unremarkable cargo plane crossed the Arctic Pole. Soviet radar operators, without a second thought, marked them as civilian traffic. The airliners penetrate a blind spot between the radar fields of Nordland and the Boreal Peninsula. Once inside the perimeter, the 747s, according to the scenario, release a swarm of 30 microfighters. These machines would be too small for long-range flights, but perfect for a short, furious sprint. They would dive, hugging the ground, at an altitude of just 50 meters, hiding below the radar horizon. Their targets, the airfields where Soviet interceptors sat on the tarmac like sleeping predators. The mighty MiG-25s would be incinerated on the ground before they could even start their engines. The radar stations would be blinded. And then, meeting no resistance, would come the waves of B-52 bombers. The conclusion of the investigation was unequivocal. The 747-based airborne aircraft carrier was a first-strike disarming weapon, a key that could pick the lock of Soviet defenses in a single turn. But the Soviets needed hard evidence. They needed to see this beast in the flesh. By the mid-70s, the paranoia had reached its peak. Every unexplained blip on a radar screen was examined under a microscope. And then, the proof, as they saw it, presented itself. The pilot of an Aeroflot civilian airliner on a flight near Port Zardia reported, his voice cracking with excitement, that he had seen a massive dark silhouette moving in tight formation with a swarm of angry hornets. It was likely just a trick of the imagination caused by fatigue, or a misidentification of American carrier-based aircraft from a nearby aircraft carrier. But for the investigators, it became confirmation of their worst fears. The Americans, they concluded, were testing their system at night over the desolate expanses of the Azure Ocean. It got worse. The investigation grew darker. Now, Soviet analysts were asking a new question. Who? Who would agree to fly these tiny, claustrophobic, suicidal machines? They began to dissect American recruitment schemes. They looked for a new type of pilot, a hybrid of an aviator and an astronaut. Men of short stature, but with reflexes on the edge of human capability. KGB agents sent reports of a new training program at the Mojave Test Range, where lifting bodies and experimental aerodynamic shapes were being tested. In Moscow, they had no doubt this was the training base for the parasite squadrons. It was at this moment that the chain of flawed conclusions and assumptions solidified into unshakable doctrine. The Soviet leadership became convinced that the Americans were not just creating a new aircraft, they were creating a new branch of the Air Force. They were convinced the microfighter was already in service. They estimated it could reach Mach 2, carry 2 air-to-air missiles, and had a combat radius of 300 kilometers. To this phantom fighter, born of fear and speculation, they assigned a code name, Goblin. The phantom aircraft was given a code name, Goblin. And in this logic, however flawed its foundation, there was a terrifying elegance. The Americans had the money. They had the Boeing 747 airframe. They had the motive. So why wouldn't they build it? To the Soviet mindset, the very idea of abandoning a weapon system because of its cost was sacrilege. In the Volkovian Union, if a weapon provided an advantage, it was built, and the price paid by the people was irrelevant. They projected this ruthless philosophy onto the Pentagon. During the investigation, analysts stumbled upon, or rather misinterpreted, scraps of data concerning the American CL-1201 project. This was a Lockheed concept for a gigantic nuclear-powered aircraft the size of a hotel, capable of carrying and launching 22 fighters. Although the CL-1201 was pure fantasy that never left the drawing board, Soviet intelligence intercepted vague communications about nuclear engines and long-endurance platforms. In their minds, the practical 747-based plan merged with the fantastical atomic Leviathan. The result was a monstrous hybrid born in their imagination. A Boeing 747 with a nuclear heart, capable of loitering for weeks near the borders of the Volkovian Union, waiting for the moment to spew a swarm of fighters from its belly. General Arthur Vance, sifting through mountains of these reports in '75, slammed his fist on the table in fury. The papers jumped. "They are surrounding us with flying airfields," he roared, his face contorted in a grimace of helpless rage. "We build static fortresses while they create mobile cavalry." The investigation never found irrefutable proof that one photograph of a fighter dropping from the belly of a Boeing. But it found so much smoke that the entire main intelligence directorate was suffocating on it. The very absence of evidence became the ultimate proof, a testament to unparalleled American skill in concealment. "If we can't see them," became the leitmotif of the analysts' reports. This line of thinking led to a dangerous shift in Soviet strategy. The question was replaced by, the GRU estimated the enemy fleet at 50 converted Boeing 747s. That meant 500 microfighters, an entire air force, outnumbering those of most European nations, completely hidden inside the fuselages of planes that appeared to be flying tourists to the Sunstone Islands. The psychological blow was devastating. The entire Soviet air defense system was built on IFF, identify friend or foe, signals, and flight plans. But if the enemy could hide inside a civilian flight, the whole system collapsed. The investigators realized with horror that to stop this threat, they would have to be prepared to shoot down civilian airliners on mere suspicion. Their investigation had led them to the edge of a terrifying abyss. To protect the motherland from this Trojan horse, they might have to become monsters themselves, launching missiles at passenger planes. By the end of the 70s, the file on the American airborne aircraft carrier had grown into thick volumes, full of details, schematics, and calculations. But at its core, it was composed of nightmares and engineering speculation. The Soviets had investigated a ghost and convinced themselves it was a living monster. But while paranoia thickened in the Volkovian Union, across the ocean, under the harsh fluorescent lights of American design bureaus, the reality was far more prosaic and far more brilliant. The Soviets were looking for a weapon of total war. They had no idea that the Americans were fighting a different battle against the laws of physics and the brutal reality of budget cuts. The investigation was complete. The conclusion was drawn. The threat was real. The threat was imminent. And the Volkovian Union was defenseless against it. And now we must change our perspective. Leave the smoke-filled offices of the Citadel and travel to the very source of this mystery. We must see what the Americans were actually building and learn the truth. A truth that would have left General Arthur Vance stunned into silence. While General Arthur Vance and his analysts in Krasnograd choked on stale coffee and chased shadows in the Siberian night, the bright sun shone over the manicured lawns of Patriot Air Force Base in Springfield, Westmoreland. The year was 1973. The year was 1973, and the air here was not thick with Cold War paranoia, but with boundless, almost defiant optimism. This was the era of the Apollo program. The Republic of Colombia had just left footprints on the moon and brought its heroes home. In the echoing halls of the Air Force Flight Dynamics Laboratory, there was an intoxicating sense that physics was not a set of immutable laws, but rather a set of guidelines that could be revised with a sufficient budget and enough titanium. It was here, in the merciless fluorescent glare of American engineering, that the ghost that would haunt the Citadel for years was born. And it was not the creation of spies in dark coats plotting a clandestine operation. No, it was a government contract, publicly announced and proudly accepted by the Boeing company. The official project name was the Airborne Aircraft Carrier, or AAC. The idea was simple in concept, but audacious to the point of madness in execution. The U.S. Air Force looked at a map of the world and saw a problem. The Volkovian Union was vast. In the event of war, American bombers, those heavyweight giants like the B-52 Stratofortress, would have to cross thousands of miles of hostile sky to reach their targets. But their protectors, the swift and agile fighter jets, had an Achilles heel: short legs. The fuel in their tanks burned out too quickly. They physically could not escort their charges all the way to Krasnograd and back. And so, within the walls of the Air Force, a bold question was asked. What if we take the airfield with us? Boeing's answer was not just a proposal, it was a symphony of engineering precision. They didn't just sketch a comic book-worthy design. They engineered an entire ecosystem of aerial warfare. The centerpiece of this vision was the Boeing 747-200, a shining triumph of American aviation and the largest commercial aircraft in the world. Boeing proposed to cut open this Leviathan and gut it. They would tear out the luxurious seats, movie screens, and galleys. In their place, inside the pressurized fuselage, they designed a multi-level hangar deck. It was from here that the incredible blueprints that later landed on the desks of Soviet intelligence were born. The plan called for the 747 to carry not passengers, but a squadron of 10 microfighters. And these were not existing aircraft, like the bulky F-4 Phantom IIs. Those were too heavy and clumsy. No, Boeing designed a completely new machine from scratch, designated the Model 985-121. To Soviet analysts, they looked like parasites. To Boeing engineers, they were masterpieces of miniaturization. The Model 985 was a tiny delta-winged Aero. It looked like a paper airplane forged from metal, with a wingspan of just 17 feet. The pilot essentially didn't sit in the plane, but wore it, strapping the engine to his back and the wings to his shoulders. But despite its toy-like dimensions, this little marvel, engineers claimed, could accelerate to Mach 1.5 and withstand G-forces that would tear a larger aircraft apart. But the true genius of the American plan, the very detail that inspired terror and birthed legends of air supremacy, lay in the launch and recovery system. It was this part of the project that must have sent a chill down General Arthur Vance's spine. Boeing designed a gigantic internal conveyor, resembling a dry cleaner's rack, only built to hold 10,000-pound fighters. The 747 was intended to have 2 launch bays, one under the nose and another in the tail. And this is how American engineers envisioned this aerial ballet. The 747 carrier is cruising at 40,000 feet. Suddenly, radar detects approaching Soviet MiG-25 interceptors. The carrier's captain, without changing expression, flips a switch. In the steel belly of the giant, the conveyor comes to life. One of the microfighters is smoothly lowered onto a mechanical arm, a trapeze that extends from the 747's belly directly into the roaring headwind. The microfighter pilot starts his engine. The trapeze clamp releases. For a split second, the tiny plane drops, then catches the airflow and, with a deafening roar, streaks off to intercept the enemy. But the real miracle, the part that defied the laws of physics, was to be their return. Landing a plane on the ground is difficult. Landing it on the moving deck of an aircraft carrier in a raging sea is even harder. Landing a fighter on the deck of a moving aircraft carrier is a task of unimaginable difficulty. But what if you tried to dock it with a mechanical arm dangling from another plane, hurtling through the clouds at 500 miles per hour? It sounds like pure madness. Yet the Americans were convinced they had tamed this beast. The solution was a fully automated flight control system. The microfighter would approach the giant Boeing 747 from the rear, at which point an onboard computer would take over, flawlessly synchronizing the speeds of the 2 aircraft. The fighter would then extend a docking probe, hook onto a loop at the end of the trapeze, and the mechanical arm would pull it inside the 747, like a fisherman hauling his catch from the ocean of the sky. Once aboard, the fighter would be immediately rearmed, refueled, and placed back on the conveyor, ready for another sortie. It was this engineering elegance that captured the essence of the American approach to the Cold War. While the Soviets bet on brute force, building more tanks and static missile silos, The Americans tried to rewrite the laws of geography with technology. The study conducted by Boeing was astonishingly comprehensive. The engineers calculated everything: fuel consumption, bomb load, and even the psychological stress levels of pilots waiting for their launch in the dark, cramped fuselage of a 747. The sheer scale of the project was a stunning demonstration of economic power. The feasibility study alone, just to see if the numbers added up, cost nearly $1 million in 1970s money. The Americans called this concept, a squadron of these flying aircraft carriers could loiter anywhere on the planet, striking over the vast waters of the Sapphire Ocean or the ice caps of the Arctic Pole. They needed no foreign bases, no permission from allies. It was an island of sovereign American territory floating in the heavens at subsonic speed. For the engineers at Patriot Air Force Base, this idea was not a monster from a nightmare. It was an equation. And to everyone's amazement, the equation worked. Wind tunnel tests proved that launching a microfighter was perfectly safe. The aerodynamics of the 747 were stable enough to withstand the opening of its giant cargo bay doors. And the engines of the 747-200 variant had enough power to carry the additional weight of 10 fighters, along with their fuel and armament. A palpable sense of awe permeates the documents from that era. The engineers felt they were on the cusp of a revolution. They imagined a future where the Republic of Columbia Air Force would no longer need vulnerable runways. They envisioned entire fleets of 747s patrolling the skies like sharks, invulnerable to any strike that could wipe a traditional airbase off the map. The Soviets were right to be afraid, but they were afraid of the wrong thing. They feared the weapon itself. What they should have feared was the industrial and intellectual capacity that allowed a nation to even conceive of such a thing. The Volkovian Union struggled to produce reliable toasters and efficient grain harvesters. At the same time, the Republic of Columbia was designing flying aircraft carriers simply because it might be a more efficient way to deliver air power. The gap was not just in technology. It was in imagination and resources. As the study progressed through 1973 and 1974, the designs grew even more ambitious. Boeing proposed a micro-tanker version, so the tiny planes could refuel each other in mid-air. Then came a version for airborne early warning and control. They were creating an entire air army in miniature, destined to live inside the belly of a giant. But there was one key detail that the stolen Soviet documents either failed to highlight or that the Soviet translators missed in their panic: the human factor. American test pilots looked at the microfighter blueprints and shook their heads with grim doubt. The cockpit was as cramped as a coffin, as if the pilot were being buried alive. The aircraft was so small that it had virtually no redundant systems. The failure of any single component meant certain death. And the recovery maneuver itself, the delicate capture of the trapeze in unpredictable turbulence, demanded a level of precision that chilled the blood of even the most seasoned aces. It was a game on the verge of suicide. The procedure chilled the blood of even the most seasoned aces. Furthermore, the very tempo of combat sorties would become a logistical nightmare. After launching the fighters, it took time to bring them back. Imagine 10 aircraft in the sky, all with their fuel warning lights blinking at once. The giant 747 could only recover them one at a time. The last pilot in that queue, with a cold sweat on his brow, would watch his fuel gauge creep inexorably towards zero, desperately waiting for the life-saving trapeze to descend. But for the world outside the hangars and cockpits, these were just temporary difficulties. The American defense industry painted a picture of unstoppable progress. America wove a veil of secrecy around its new creation. They had the blueprints, they had the wind tunnel results, they had the airframes ready. By the mid-70s, the concept was fully mature. The Air Force was ready to pull the trigger and order a fleet of AAC prototypes. The technology existed. The threat to the Soviets was more than real. It was the height of secrecy. The Americans stood on the threshold of a new era of warfare, holding the keys to dominion of the skies. The Soviet Union, watching anxiously from afar, was certain the Americans had already opened that door. But history, as we know, rarely follows the straight lines of engineering blueprints. This impossible project was about to collide with a force far more powerful than the Soviet Army and far more ruthless than the laws of aerodynamics, the harsh reality of strategic evolution. And while Soviet MiG-25s furiously tore through the skies in search of phantom carriers, the Americans were silently looking at the project's price tag, and then at another entirely new technology emerging from the shadows. Something that would turn the gigantic 747-based aircraft carrier into an expensive anachronism before it ever took flight. The project was real, but its outcome would be the most stunning shock of all. 1976. At a wind-swept airfield in the Soviet Eastern Territories, a new, ominous silhouette was rolled out from a hardened hangar. Angular and massive, it radiated a primal power. It was the MiG-31. To the uninitiated, it might have looked like just an upgraded version of the old MiG-25. But for the engineers at the Mikoyan Design Bureau, it was a quantum leap. It was born with a single, terrifying purpose: to hunt the very ghosts America was about to unleash into the sky. The Soviet leadership, convinced by intelligence data of the inevitable arrival of the American airborne aircraft carrier, had thrown billions of rubles into creating this antidote. They were certain that a swarm of American microfighters, flying at extremely low altitudes below the radar horizon, could only be stopped by an interceptor capable of looking down and engaging targets below it. The MiG-31 was a technological marvel born of paranoia. It was the world's first production fighter equipped with a passive, electronically scanned array radar, the legendary Zaslon. This radar was a beast. Weighing half a ton, it could simultaneously track 10 targets and guide missiles to 4 of them. It was designed to tear into a teeming swarm of American parasites and shred it with long-range AA-9 Amos missiles. General Arthur Vance and his colleagues watched the tests with a grim, heavy satisfaction. They had created the perfect shield. They had forged a predator capable of tearing the American hive to pieces. The years passed. The Soviet air defense system held its breath. MiG-31 regiments stood watch on the northern borders. Their radars tirelessly scanned the icy skies over the polar sea, searching for that one giant Boeing 747 blip on the screen that would be followed by the sudden, deadly blossom of separating fighters. The pilots were drilled on one scenario: ignore the mother, kill the swarm. But the sky remained pristine. The unthinkable invasion they so expected and feared never came. The resolution came not with the explosion of a missile, not with a declaration of war. It came, as it so often did in the Cold War, with a quiet rustle, the rustle of a single, devastating piece of paper that landed on a desk in the Citadel in the early 1980s. The early 80s. An intelligence report on the status of American programs for new air-launched strategic missiles lands on the desk. Line by line, the report details the shutdown of Boeing's AAC project. The Americans had stopped work. The microfighters would not roll off the assembly lines. The conveyor belts would not be installed in the fuselages of the 747s. At first, a wave of relief swept through the offices of Krasnograd. Was this victory? Had the mere threat of the MiG-31 forced the Americans to back down? Had the Soviet shield proven impenetrable to the American sword? But the deeper the analysts read into the dry lines of the report, the faster their relief turned to a cold, bone-chilling horror. The Americans hadn't given up out of fear. Not because the technology was too complex. They had abandoned the project because they had found something far more terrifying. The realization hit the Soviet command with the force of a physical blow. The report stated that the Republic of Colombia Air Force had conducted a ruthless cost-benefit analysis. They understood that sending a human into combat from a 747 was expensive, dangerous, and morally questionable. A pilot has a family. He requires a complex life support system. He can be shot down, captured, interrogated. And so the Americans asked themselves a question that froze the blood in their veins. Why send a man to do a robot's job? The ghost the Soviet Union had been chasing, the microfighter, had given way to the AGM-86 Air-Launched Cruise Missile, ALCM. And this discovery was monstrous. The concept of a Boeing 747 flying aircraft carrier hadn't died. It had mutated. Now, the Americans were considering a cruise missile carrier aircraft, CMCA. Instead of 10 manned fighters, a single Boeing 747 could carry rotary launchers with 72 long-range cruise missiles. It was a shock. Suddenly, it was clear. The Soviets had been preparing for an elegant boxing match, a duel of agile fighters. And the Americans had just brought a shotgun to the ring. A manned microfighter had to break through to the target, drop its bomb, and return to the carrier to survive. Its capabilities were limited by the endurance of the human inside. But a cruise missile, it was a disposable killer, a suicide machine by its very nature. It was smaller than a fighter, harder to detect on radar, and could fly to its target at treetop level from a distance of 1,500 kilometers. It didn't need to come back. General Arthur Vance looked at the specifications of the MiG-31. Yes, it was an incredible machine. But could it intercept 72 missiles launched from a single aircraft before they fanned out? The math was merciless. If the Americans sent up 10 747s, that would be 720 missiles. The Soviet air defense system, the densest and most layered in the world, would be overwhelmed in minutes. The futility of any response became suffocatingly clear. For the past decade, the Soviets had been obsessed with the microfighter threat. They had built the heavy, supersonic, and fantastically expensive MiG-31 to fight other aircraft, and now they faced a threat that made the very concept of air combat obsolete. The Boeing 747 flying aircraft carrier project had served as a perfect, albeit unintentional, decoy. While the USSR frantically sought an antidote to, quote, 112 fighters, the Americans were quietly perfecting the guidance systems and miniature turbofan engines that made cruise missiles a reality. The incredible technology wasn't the launch mechanism from a mothership. It was the computer brain inside each missile. The Soviet response was an act of desperation. Scrapping the MiG-31 was no longer an option. Too much had been invested. So they had to squeeze even more out of them. Upgrade the radars. Build new SAM sites. The economic costs were staggering. The Citadel demanded to know why had intelligence missed this turn. The answer was ridiculously simple. The Americans hadn't hidden it. All the debates about choosing between manned bombers and cruise missiles were documented in open congressional records. But the Soviet command, blinded by its own military doctrine, simply refused to believe that a superpower would trade living pilots for slow, unmanned missiles. It was a fundamental gap in military philosophy, a schism between man and machine, between the manned fighter and the soulless missile. For one side, the pilot was the heart and soul of the Air Force. For the Americans, he was just a component of the system, an element that could be removed to save weight. It was a clash of worlds, heroism and brute force versus cold efficiency and calculated lethality. And in 1980, the veil was lifted. The U.S. Air Force transformed its B-52 Stratofortresses, turning them into cruise missile carriers. They didn't even need the giant 747. The B-52, an aircraft the Volkovian Union contemptuously considered a dinosaur, was suddenly reborn. It became a standoff weapons platform, capable of obliterating Soviet targets without ever crossing their airspace. This revelation was a moment of profound strategic humiliation. The main intelligence directorate realized with chilling horror that it had been fighting a shadow all along. The massive 747, spewing a swarm of fighters, was an image from a cinematic nightmare. But the reality was far more terrifying. An old bomber launching 20 silent, invisible robot killers from 1,000 miles away. That was the real apocalypse. The best pilots of the Volkovian Union, aces in MiG-25s and MiG-31s, sat in their cockpits on high alert, their eyes scanning the horizon. They craved a fight, preparing for a grand duel with American aces in the sky. But the enemy they awaited never came. The Americans weren't going to send their heroes to die in the frozen skies of the northern expanse. Why would they, when they could send microchips and circuit boards instead? The true shock was not that the Americans had a new superweapon. It was that they had so radically rewritten the rules of war that the Soviet superweapon had become a useless tool for hunting ghosts. When this realization pierced through, a new, even darker rumor began to creep through the corridors of the KGB. If the Americans had abandoned the 747 airborne carrier in favor of cruise missiles, what else were they working on in the deepest secrecy? Whispers began of an aircraft that didn't show up on radar at all, of an aircraft that was not just small, but completely invisible. The 747 carrier investigation had drained the Soviet analysts. It had them chasing parasites and motherships. It had become the perfect distraction. And while they looked up, scanning commercial airliners for a disguised Boeing 747, Lockheed engineers in the sun-scorched Iridian desert were painting a strange, faceted aircraft coal black, hiding it from the entire world. The ultimate irony of this exposé was that the Volkovian Union was preparing for a loud, spectacular war of aerial acrobatics and nightly duels. Instead, it faced a quiet, invisible strangulation by stealth technology and precision-guided weapons. The mystery of the 747 aircraft carrier was solved. It was a dead end, a grand misdirection. But for the Volkovian Union, the price of this knowledge, billions of rubles wasted, years of effort squandered, a gaping hole in its strategy, became a wound that would never heal. They had chased a phantom, and in the chase, they failed to notice the real monsters sneaking up behind them. The phantom fleet of Boeing 747 aircraft carriers never dropped a single fighter in combat. The conveyor belts were never installed. The tiny pilots never climbed into their claustrophobic cockpits. But in the grand and cold calculus of the Cold War, the project achieved a stunning, crushing victory. It accomplished precisely what a strategic weapon is designed to do. It forced the enemy to bankrupt itself in a desperate attempt to counter it. The verdict of history can be measured in one staggering figure. By the early 1980s, the Volkovian Union was spending, by various estimates, between 15 and 17% of its entire gross national product on defense. And a huge portion of that feverish spending flowed into the country's air defense forces. To stop the threat of American air supremacy, first the bombers, then the ghost of the 747 carrier, and finally the cruise missiles, the Volkovian Union built the largest and most expensive defensive network in human history. 5,000 radar stations, 12,000 surface-to-air missile launchers, a fleet of over 2,600 interceptor aircraft. And here is the devastating verdict in numbers. According to U.S. Air Force calculations, against the new generation of low-flying cruise missiles, the technology that replaced the 747 project, this multi-billion ruble Soviet shield would have had a negligible chance of success, less than 20%. The Soviets had invested a fortune in a wall to stop an ocean tide. They built the MiG-31 to shoot down giant motherships, but the Americans responded by simply planning to flood their airspace with a swarm of cheap drones. This colossal failure reflected the central drama of the Cold War, the clash of a rigid, unwieldy command economy with a flexible and inventive one. The Soviet system was a master of brute force and scale. If the threat was a tank, they built two. If it was a plane, they built a faster plane. But this system desperately lacked finesse and maneuverability. Once the legend of the 747 airborne aircraft carrier took root within the walls of the citadel, the giant bureaucratic machine could not be stopped. They bet everything on a single countermeasure, the heavy interceptor, and could not deviate from that path even when the Americans publicly announced the cancellation of the threat itself. The Republic of Colombia, in contrast, approached military technology like an investment portfolio. The 747 airborne aircraft carrier was a brilliant engineering idea, but a failed business plan. Too complex, too risky. So the Americans ruthlessly buried it. They were not seduced by the audacious beauty of a flying aircraft carrier. They bet on the cold, murderous efficiency of the cruise missile. It was this ability to abandon a bad idea for a brilliant one that constituted the Americans' key advantage. The Soviets were playing checkers, predictably and straightforwardly moving their pieces across the board. The Americans were playing poker. They bluffed with a pair of twos, the 747 concept, knowing they had a royal flush hidden up their sleeve: cruise missiles and stealth technology. The legacy of the Boeing 747 airborne aircraft carrier is not found in museums or aircraft boneyards, for it was never built. Its legacy is etched into the ruins of the Volkovian Union itself. The economic exhaustion from endlessly trying to counter every American idea, real or imagined, eroded the very foundations of the Volkovian Union. They starved their own civilian economy to feed a military machine that was chasing ghosts born on the pages of American technical proposals. Today, the idea of an airborne aircraft carrier is experiencing a renaissance. Armed with modern unmanned technology, the U.S. military is once again exploring the concept of launching swarms of drones from transport aircraft like the C-130 or C-17. The Gremlins program is a direct spiritual successor to the 747 project. The physics remain the same, but technology has finally caught up with the bold imagination of the 70s. But that first story serves as a stark warning and a fascinating example of psychological warfare. In the end, the Boeing 747 didn't need to take off to win the war. It was enough for it to simply exist as a terrifying possibility. The mere image of the Queen of the Skies opening its belly to unleash hell was enough to haunt the nightmares of the Soviet High Command. General Arthur Vance and his analysts looked at a civilian airliner and saw a weapon of mass destruction. But what struck them was not the gleam of aluminum or the smell of jet fuel, but the transcendent, unthinkable audacity of the enemy. They realized they were at war with a country capable of turning anything into a sword, even a symbol of peace and travel, if it promised victory. The 747 aircraft carrier became the greatest weapon that never flew. It was a victory of spirit over matter, proving that in the Cold War, the most dangerous weapon was not the one sitting on the runway.